Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for an American Ambulance Association webinar. We appreciate your support and participation. As a webinar relating to resilience or mental health, this course is available free to all EMS providers as part of our commitment to supporting field personnel. This session is being recorded. To access the recording, please visit ambulance.org's on-demand webinar section at least 48 hours after today's live session. The video will also be included in the next AAA member digest. The chat is going to be disabled for participants during this webinar. Instead, to ask questions of our presenter, please use the Q&A function represented by the double dialog bubble button. Thanks again for joining us, and with that, it's my pleasure to welcome today's presenter. Sari, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Amanda. I am really happy to be here today to talk about something I'm very, very passionate about, and that is mental health and EMS. Over the last few years, it's a topic that we explore more and more, and I'm excited to go a little bit deeper into that conversation. So a little bit about me. Again, my name is Sari Goldberg. I work at Guilford County Emergency Services in Greensboro, North Carolina. I'm our mental health coordinator. So I coordinate our peer support team. I work one-on-one with employees. We do proactive trainings at all of our employee touch points, starting with new employee orientation and going all the way up. I work under another administrator who is in charge of employee wellness as a whole, everything from physical injuries to navigating FMLA and HR things, and then everything behavioral or mental health kind of falls under my purview. We're a busy service. We have about 350 full-time employees, over 3 divisions of emergency management, fire, and EMS, with EMS being our largest division. And we run about 90,000 calls a year in a very diverse geographical area, everything from urban big cities to suburban areas to rural farmlands. So we see a little bit of everything. I've been in EMS for some time. I started as an EMT in 2009, became a paramedic through our in-house paramedic academy. And I really saw a need in terms of mental health that wasn't being addressed. I saw people leaving the field. I saw people getting really burned out. I saw people doing things like abusing alcohol, and really none of that was being talked about. So I went back to school and got a master's degree in 2017 in mental health counseling. And then I was lucky enough in 2019 to have a position sort of created where I could use some of those skills. Initially, it was on a 50-50 type basis. So I spent half my time in the field running calls and the other half the time in the office doing mental health stuff. Although as of last summer, that's now a full-time position, and I'm in the office doing mental health related activities, working with employees, doing trainings. I'm doing that full-time now. So that's just a little bit about me. So what is being a duck? So I'm sure this is not something that really needs explanation. It's a term that we've all heard, but in my mind, it's making sure everything from the outside looks smooth and calm, no matter how chaotic things are on the inside. And that's not terrible advice for when you're out there running calls in stressful situations, in circumstances where you need to act quickly. The problem is when this becomes internalized and people take this idea of everything always staying calm on the outside into their personal lives, into the way they approach adversity as a whole. So I want you to think for a minute on what is strength. When you think of a person who is strong, what do you picture? And I think a lot of us have an idea of kind of the strong, silent type. Somebody who never complains, who never needs to seek help. And I want to kind of challenge that viewpoint today, because I would argue that resilience is not demonstrated through silence, and as a matter of fact, silence is kind of the antithesis of resilience in a lot of ways. So a lot of this comes back to the idea of stoicism, and stoicism goes back honestly to the ancient Greeks, and we've kind of adopted it into our culture, especially in public safety. And stoicism is defined as the endurance of pain or hardship without the display of feelings and without complaint. And this has sort of become the cultural expectation of how the ideal EMT or paramedic, or really anybody in public safety, how they should behave and deal with things. So any display of emotion becomes sort of an aberrancy. It's outside of the norm. And this creates a stigma around mental health, that seeking help is not what we're supposed to do. What we're supposed to do is just kind of suck it up. And so a little bit about stigma. So stigma generally encompasses these things: labeling, exclusion, discrimination, stereotyping. Stigma is defined as a mark of disgrace. And what this does is it makes people feel weak or othered, like you're not part of the group, for not being able to handle stressors, or for not handling stressors in the same way as others appear to be. And I think the appear to be is important because, again, we're looking at things from the outside. We're looking at the top of the water. We don't know what's happening underneath the water, yet we're comparing ourselves only to what we can see. And everybody wants to feel part of a group. No one wants to feel excluded. In fact, some research that looks into first responders in particular and help-seeking behaviors, which means getting the resources you need when you need them. The number one barrier to reaching out for help is not wanting to appear weak, which is exactly what that stigma does. On the other side of the spectrum, the number one facilitator for seeking help is feeling like you aren't alone. And the only way to do that is by letting people in and having those difficult conversations, and not always portraying this stoicism and this kind of silent strength. So how did we kind of get here culturally? Well, maintaining your composure on EMS scenes is a necessity. We have to be able to do that. We have to be able to keep our emotions in check so that we can be professionals and react in the way we need in these very difficult and challenging circumstances. And that's something we need to be able to know how to do. What can happen, though, is that stoicism ends up being internalized as part of somebody's identity. And that identity is that I can handle anything, nothing bothers me. And the correct way to deal with these things is to, again, not complain and not express emotion about it. Because of this, because nothing bothers me, and this way of dealing with things works for me, there's no need to learn other coping skills that may be healthier and maybe more advantageous to better long-term mental health outcomes. So the question is, how do we move on from here? How do we get past this point culturally to where we accept a broader range of dealing with the things that we encounter? So here are some common coping mechanisms that are utilized by lots of people all over the world, and some are healthier than others, some we want to totally avoid. But escaping and avoiding is by far the number one coping mechanism used by people in public safety. And it is considered a maladaptive or non-adaptive coping style that's associated with negative outcomes. So just to define avoidance a little bit, it generally has to do with the suppression of emotions, not sharing or expressing your feelings, denying the meanings of sort of the hardships that we face, and then emotionally sort of being numb. And this can go for negative emotions as well as positive emotions, unfortunately. And this is kind of what we have always called, sucking it up, which used to be a thing that we would say to people in the field, even newer people in the field. And I think that's something we've sort of moved on from verbalizing. However, it's still something we're kind of doing with our behavior. So some of the problems with avoidance coping, there are problems for the individual as well as for the organization. So avoidance coping, we know, is associated with significantly higher rates of PTSD, as well as greater severity of those PTSD symptoms. We know that people who use avoidance coping have less confidence in their ability to bounce back from adversity. We know they have higher rates of burnout, higher rates of compassion fatigue. Their overall well-being tends to be lower. They have poorer physical health, and they're at increased risk of suicidal behavior. Now, in terms of the organization, We see things like chronic and acute staffing issues. This is due to absenteeism as an avoidance behavior, causing unexpected absences, as well as things like long-term retention and turnover issues as a result of compassion fatigue and burnout and PTSD. We see decreased morale because employees who are compassion fatigued and burnt out are not happy to be there. They're not encouraging their coworkers to have a good attitude. We see lower patient satisfaction because employees that are burnt out and fatigued make mistakes. They're less likely to show compassion for their patients, more likely to get complaints from their patients. And then as an organization, when we are utilizing avoidance on kind of that organizational level, we don't have the ability to identify problems, and then we don't have the ability to address those problems and make positive change in innovative ways because we're sort of keeping things the way they've always been done. So a little bit about post-traumatic stress. So a recent study showed that as many as 57% of firefighters screen positive for PTSD. Now, if you look at the literature for EMS, especially from the last decade, you see numbers that are all over the place, from as low as the low teens all the way up to the high 30s. But going based upon some internal assessments that we've done at our agency, I believe this 57%. It sounds like a high number, but I believe it probably is an accurate number. And then we know that avoidant coping is linked to having an increased risk of developing PTSD, as well as those symptoms being more severe. And I do want to say a little bit about post-traumatic stress because I think it's important. And that is, I like to think of it, and I teach it as being more of an injury than a disorder. So to me, a disorder asks the question of what's wrong with you, and an injury asks the question of what happened to you. And I think that's a big difference. A disorder kind of has a negative connotation. It sounds like something you're going to have forever, whereas an injury is something that happens to you that you can recover and heal from. So in the same way that somebody might have to pick up a large patient at a weird angle and pull a muscle in their back, we would never discourage them from seeking medical care for that injury. And perhaps they would go to physical therapy for a few weeks and return to their previous level of function. And I think we should think of stress injuries as no different. It's just the trauma happens to be to the brain as a result of an experience. And there is still the possibility that they can have a few weeks or a few months of treatment and return to their previous level of function in just the same way you would recover from an injury. So symptoms of post-traumatic stress injuries also do not look the same in all people. So there are two main types of PTSD, classic and complex or dissociative. And going into that would be a whole separate talk in and of itself, but in a nutshell, classic PTSD tends to come from a singular traumatic event with a before, during, and after, whereas complex or dissociative PTSD tends to happen from less acute but repeated levels or exposure to trauma over long periods of time. And it tends to manifest more in social isolation and withdrawal, emotional numbness, as opposed to things like nightmares and flashbacks. And it's very underdiagnosed, especially in the first responder community. So we know that both types of PTSD are associated with abnormal structural and physiological changes in the brain and the body and the way it responds to stress. So just like you can X-ray a broken bone and see that it's broken, you can look at a brain with the right technology and see that it's been damaged from trauma. The good news is just like that broken bone, with treatment, those changes do reverse themselves. So I want to touch upon another topic, which is kind of the opposite of post-traumatic stress, and that is post-traumatic growth. So we used to think that trauma, emotional trauma, was inherently a bad thing, and that you would either come out worse or at best stay the same. And what we know now is that there actually is this phenomenon of post-traumatic growth, and that people can come out on the other side of trauma, learning things and in a better place than they were before. And so the trick now is how do we walk people down that path to where they're in that post-traumatic growth group. So some things that we see with post-traumatic growth are people tend to have a greater appreciation of life, kind of a sense that life is short. They're grateful for the time that they have. They value their close relationships more. They understand the need of social support. They often reevaluate their priorities and set new goals for themselves. They have more confidence in their ability to deal with adversity and handle anything that might come their way. And then we often see spiritual development, which doesn't have to be religious necessarily, but just a sense of where one's place in the world is and what that means in terms of the bigger picture. So these are all things that we can see as a result of trauma. So what about burnout? So burnout is something I'm sure everybody's talking about at all of your agencies, because studies show that upwards of 70 to 80% of EMS professionals that are screen positive for at least some degree of burnout. So this is incredibly, incredibly common. So burnout has 3 domains to it. It has this emotional, mental, and physical exhaustion, feeling helpless and ineffective, cynicism and callousness, and these all kind of play together. So one doesn't have to happen before the other, but the course it typically takes is the exhaustion kind of comes first. I'm so busy, I'm so tired, I don't know if I can do this. That leads to the helpless and ineffective, and it doesn't seem like it's making a difference anyway. We're not really helping people. And as kind of a defense mechanism to that, the cynicism and callousness comes along that says, well, I guess it doesn't really matter anyway. None of this really matters. And this becomes a vicious cycle that can be very hard for people to get out of. So compassion fatigue is another term that we hear kind of thrown around a lot along with burnout in terms of EMS professionals. And I just want to take a second and go over kind of the difference between the two. So compassion fatigue has to do with being exposed to suffering. Compassion fatigue is the toll of having empathy for people who are going through terrible situations. Burnout, on the other hand, is an occupational phenomenon. Burnout has to do with workload and organizational stress. So in a nutshell, if you really want to whittle it down, compassion fatigue is trauma related. Burnout is not trauma related. So how compassion fatigue and burnout sort of tie into what we're talking about today, and that is avoidance coping. So studies have shown that avoidance coping was a predictive factor in all domains of burnout, meaning somebody who was high in avoidance coping were more likely to show all 3 domains of burnout. Whereas people who used more active coping skills, which we're going to talk about later in the presentation, were less likely to experience any of those domains of burnout. As far as compassion fatigue, this study looked at a variety of different coping styles and found that out of all of them, avoidance was the most correlated with compassion fatigue. And just on the positive side of that, problem solving was actually the most correlated with compassion satisfaction, which is the opposite of compassion fatigue. So compassion satisfaction is defined as the amount of pleasure you derive from helping others. And really it's compassion satisfaction that's what allows us to continue to find purpose and meaning in our work, despite the trauma we see, despite the way we're treated sometimes by the public and by patients. Compassion satisfaction is what gets us up in the morning and lets us feel fulfilled by the work that we do. We want our providers to be this person getting joy in even the everyday call and the little bit that they're able to help people. We do not want them to be these people who I think everybody is familiar with it at this point. These are the EMS professionals who were charged with murder after a patient died lying prone on their stretcher. And if you want to see the embodiment of what burnout and compassion fatigue look like, watch the body cam videos from this call that they ran, and you will see totally disconnected, totally burnt out individuals. And the sad thing is it's unlikely that they started their career that way. This is something that probably happened to them. So we want to talk about some specific avoidance behaviors. And this is not an exhaustive list, but these are some of the most common, the ones that affect us. And those are dissociation, substance use, and absenteeism. So dissociation is kind of like emotionally playing dead. So dissociation happens when your sympathetic nervous system gets triggered and you cannot fight your way out of that situation, nor can you flee or leave the situation, but you're having strong emotions about it. So your brain just sort of severs that connection between what's happening and the way you feel about it. This usually happens without any kind of conscious awareness. This is not something people decide to do. It's something that just happens. And like I said on a call, this allows us to function. The problem is the brain can quickly learn how effective this is. And it can happen without that conscious awareness, even in other situations that would elicit strong emotions. And that's when it really becomes a problem. So there are two types of dissociation. One is depersonalization, and that is sort of an out-of-body experience, where it feels like whatever is happening is just happening to a completely other person. The other type is derealization, which is where you're in your body, you're connected to your thoughts, but it's as though everything that's happening around you is happening on a movie screen, as though it's not real. And different people tend to go towards one method or the other, but we do see some people who will experience both depending on the situation. So there are various signs that dissociation is occurring, but one of the big ones is memory loss. So if you think back to a traumatic situation that you went through, you may find that your memories are kind of like snapshots. You don't have linear, cohesive memories of the events in the order in which everything happened. It's more like looking at Polaroid pictures. And that is because when we dissociate, we don't make memories in the same way. So that's a big sign that dissociation was probably occurring. So some of the negative effects of dissociation, we already talked a little bit about how it can be positive on the scene of an emergency. But again, the problem lies when this happens in other situations. So while beneficial when treating a patient, when you're perhaps a heated conversation with a loved one and strong emotions start to rise up and your brain decides, I know what to do here. It's time to dissociate. That's non-productive because we want to be present for those moments. We want to feel the emotions that are associated. We want to remember those events and conversations. So that can really be a problem for people. Another avoidance behavior that we see really commonly is substance use. So this study from 2009 was actually looking at occupational risk factors among EMS professionals, and they really thought they were going to be paying more attention to things like lifting injuries and motor vehicle accidents. What they found was that negative mental health outcomes were a significant occupational risk factor, specifically finding in this study that 40% of EMTs and paramedics admitted to using substances to self-medicate their unpleasant feelings. And even outside of the realm of truly having a substance use disorder, we know that using substances to medicate feelings has a variety of negative outcomes. It is associated with developing use disorders, but it's also associated with emotion dysregulation, with depression, with reduced quality of work performance. And again, with avoidance being an effective yet maladaptive coping mechanism, once people find a coping mechanism that seems to work for them, they're unlikely to try others. So people can fall into a pattern where they use substances more and more in order to cope. So a little more about avoidance and coping. So we know that people who are high in avoidance coping, that's a strong predictor of whether or not they're abusing alcohol. We also know that people who are high in avoidance coping, when faced with trauma or difficult situations, their substance use tends to increase, even if they don't have a substance use disorder. While that's not true for people who use more active coping mechanisms. We know that the more severe a person's PTSD symptoms are, the more likely they are to be abusing alcohol. And that risk is probably bidirectional, meaning it could be because their symptoms are so severe, they're using alcohol to cope. Or it could be that because they're abusing alcohol, their symptoms are more severe. And it's likely a combination, sort of a vicious cycle of both of those things. This study looked at first responders between 2017 and 2021 in Dallas, Texas, in a large hospital chain, and they surveyed all the first responders who were seeking mental health services for any reason. They screened them for substance use disorders, and they found that 40% of them screened positive for substance use disorders, even if that had nothing to do with the reason why they were seeking help. So that just goes to show how common this is in our profession. And then kind of making this even worse is we know that in particular heavy alcohol use can alter the way our body physiologically responds to stress. Things like the HPA axis, if you're familiar with that, cortisol levels. Basically, our body becomes more sensitive to these stress responses, leading to increased drinking because there are more symptoms to try to medicate. So again, another vicious cycle that can lead people down a really kind of dark path. So absenteeism is another avoidance behavior that we see pretty commonly. So in a study of workers with chronic pain, we saw that how high they were in avoidance behaviors was actually the greatest predictor of how much sick time they would use. Not the severity of their condition or their pain, but the degree in which they employed these avoidance behaviors. We also see that people who use avoidance coping are significantly more likely to have frequent absences, and those absences tend to be longer in duration. And then with first responders in particular, they found that first responders who said they would cope with workplace stress by taking a sick day, compared to their peers, had lower overall well-being and were less likely to experience post-traumatic growth than people who coped in other ways, like through problem solving. And then we have suicide risk. So we know that avoidance coping is correlated with increased suicidal behaviors. In some ways, you can think of suicidal behaviors as sort of the ultimate form of avoidance. In a study of male firefighters, we saw that men who utilized avoidant coping had more suicidal ideation and were more likely to engage in self-harm than male firefighters who had other coping mechanisms. This study is currently being replicated among female firefighters and seems to be showing the same results. When we look at people who have a history of suicide attempts and look at the way they cope, so they are much more likely to be utilizing avoidant coping mechanisms than a control group of people who without suicidal history, and are far less likely to be using active coping skills than people in that control group. So we definitely see that these are tied together, that avoidance coping increases suicide risk. So what are some solutions for this? So these are obviously not situations we want to be in. We want our employees to be happy and healthy. We want our organizations to be productive and healthy. So what are some things that we can do? So I think the main things are through education, through encouraging social support, through both camaraderie and team building, and formally in things like peer support, as well as trying to enact some cultural change. So with education, I think it's really important to provide education about trauma and its impact. And this really needs to start at the EMS education level when people are in EMT and paramedic school. This should be something people learn about. It's part of the environment of the job, and they should know what to expect and what the risks are. But just like any skill that can deprecate over time, we need to be continuing to have these conversations with people throughout their careers. So like I said at the beginning, this is something that at every touch point we have with employees, we talk about mental health, we talk about resilience, and how people might be impacted, and then what to do if they are impacted. We need to be teaching and encouraging active coping skills. We can't assume that people are going to come baked in with the tools they need to deal with the stressors of this job, especially since they are so out of line with typical workplace stressors. We face so much more than most people do. We can't assume, especially as we're hiring a younger workforce, that they're just automatically going to know how to deal with these things. And then we want to normalize this idea of functional disconnection and functional reconnection. And I'm going to talk to you about what that means. This picture is from a training we did. These are our newest peer support team members. We actually had this 2-day training at a therapeutic horse farm for veterans and first responders. And this is just an example of whenever we have the ability to sort of get training out of the classroom and into a place to reinforce the themes of that training, we try to do that to make it memorable, so that it communicates to the employee how important it is. So as far as active coping really falls into 2 categories, those being emotion-focused and problem-focused. So problem-focused coping is when you're trying to actually make the situation better. Emotion-focused is when you're just trying to make yourself feel better about the situation, but you can't really change it. So some positive active coping mechanisms. One is positive reinterpretation, sometimes called cognitive reappraisal. In a nutshell, this is just changing the way you look at something in order to see the good in it, to see something positive or something that could have been learned or gained, so that it's not just a wholly negative experience. That's all that is. Problem solving, we know, gives people a sense of agency. It gives people a sense of control over what's happening, and can really improve outcomes and improve coping. Emotional and social support. So going back to what facilitates help-seeking behaviors, we know that people feeling like they're not alone is the number one facilitator. So social support adds to that. But by its very nature, if you're seeking social support, you're talking about your feelings to somebody else, and you are therefore not alone in those feelings. And then just acceptance. Sometimes there's not much we can do in a circumstance, but acknowledge that it happened, acknowledge how we feel about it, and then try to move on from it. And that is a different thing from denying the fact that we were impacted by it in the first place. So those really are 2 different things. So functional disconnection. So this, like dissociation, it allows management of one's reactions to stress in the moment so that we're able to function and do the things that we need to do. How it's different, though, is that this comes from conscious awareness. So there's conscious awareness of either I felt myself starting to have a reaction, or I understand logically that the events that are occurring is something I would normally react to. This is something I need to revisit and think about later. So this is deliberate and intentional, as a result, not something that's happening behind the scenes that you can later say, like, I guess it just didn't matter to me. This is something where you understand the kind of the impact, and it's something that needs to be addressed. So the other side of this is functional reconnection. So this is awareness of your physical, mental, and emotional state. So awareness of how you're feeling, what you're thinking. This is when we want to identify and sort of name the thoughts and feelings you're having. It's also a time to look for distorted or irrational thought patterns. So things like, nothing I ever do is enough, nobody appreciates us, none of this matters. Those would all be kind of distorted and irrational thoughts that we would want to challenge within ourselves. This is a time that we kind of re-engage with our personal values, because oftentimes the things that evoke strong emotions out of us are things that are at odds with the values that we sort of hold close to us. And this really can happen anytime after a call, but it is especially vital that this happens at the end of a shift as somebody moves from the work environment to their home environment. We don't want them to maintain that disconnected, sort of dissociated state as they go home to interact with their families. So one way to do this are through rituals of transition. So this is just a behavior that sort of serves as a demarcation between disconnection and reconnection. So this can be something as simple as taking your uniform off or letting your hair down. The important bit is that you don't just engage in that behavior, but you use that behavior as a time to evaluate things. So as you take your uniform off, you reflect on the day, you reflect on the calls you ran. Did I have feelings about any of those calls? Did any of those things bother me? Now that I'm thinking about them in a safe environment, is there more to any of that that I need to sort of revisit? One example of this is I know somebody who, on their commute home, they use half their drive to reflect on their day. And then when they reach a certain landmark, they start thinking about their family and the future and what's coming next. And that serves as sort of a line in the sand of moving in a cognitive way from being disconnected and in a functional space to a more reconnected, I want to be in touch with my emotions. I want to be present for the things that are about to occur. So that's just an example. And then peer support. So peer support is incredibly important. Peer support, of course, assists in processing traumatic events, so doing things like defusings and debriefings, as well as just critical incident check-ins with people, as well as managing cumulative stress and managing organizational stressors. They can do it because they go through the same thing. They're experiencing the same stressors. So again, it adds to that facilitator of feeling like you're not in it by yourself, feeling like other people are in it with you and you're not alone. And of course, they're trained to know how to help mitigate some of those stressors. We know that first responders who engage with peer support have increased overall well-being, and they're more likely to experience that post-traumatic growth that we strive for so much. And that's where we want people to get to, is away from these stress injuries and towards growing from the trauma that they experience. We know peer support reduces stigma because we're normalizing and having these conversations. It encourages help seeking, again, by showing people that they're not in it alone. Peer support also can serve as a conduit to actually connecting people to outside help resources. One thing that I will say, though, is that peer support, or effective peer support, really does require a foundational level of trust to be effective. So it really is important how you choose the people who are going to be on your peer support team, how those people are trained, how their operations are managed, and then perhaps most importantly, confidentiality. So in some states, peer support confidentiality is actually controlled by statute. So there are laws in place that protect peer support providers. That's not true in every state, but there should be confidentiality agreements for everybody on a peer support team, and there should be known consequences if confidentiality is broken, so that people feel safe with those members and they feel like that confidence is going to be kept. So this is just an example of a magnet we have here at Guilford County. We had these magnets made up. We have them up at all the bases. We give them out at our annual awards banquet. It has the number for our employee assistance program, as well as our peer support hotline number. And that peer support hotline is just a Google Voice number. So you can set up a Google Voice number for any email address. It's free. And then you can have it be forwarded to a number of different personal phone numbers. So for us, for an example, it rings to all the peer support team leaders. So people don't have to go down a list of who's on the peer support team and keep trying different numbers till they can finally reach somebody. They can just call this one number and they'll get somebody who's available. And then I think the last piece is cultural change, because none of this really is going to have as much effect as you'd like if the culture of the organization isn't safe for people to talk about these things and for people to come forward. And I think it all really starts with being a role model. So change starts at the top. And if you're always a duck, then everybody else is going to think that that's what you're supposed to do. So if there are things as a leader that are bothersome to you, that are stressful for you, have conversations about those things and set the tone that this is what we do here. There's a time to manage your emotions, and that there's a time to be vulnerable, and we know the difference between when to do those things. You want to be mindful of the language that you use. So, of course, the language you use to talk about employees that may have mental health challenges, the language you use to talk about the trauma that we're exposed to, but also even things like the language we use to talk about the psychiatric patients we run, because a lot of that can play into stigma and sort of creating an us versus them. That, well, if somebody needs mental health treatment, that's fine for them because they need it, but we're tough and we don't need it. Nobody wants to be one of them. Everybody wants to be us. So it's important to be mindful of how you frame those conversations. You want to do what you can to encourage help seeking when it's needed, or at the very first sign that something is needed. This may be EAP. Not all EAPs are created equal. Some are more competent than others, especially in treating first responders. So this may also be resources in your community. I think one of the important things that I've done over the years is I've created a network of counselors and therapists in our area with different specialties that have experience with first responders. They're culturally competent, so that when somebody does come forward looking to get connected with some help, we can do that with somebody who is going to meet their needs. We can do it in a way that is quick and easy for the employee. And we have that sort of infrastructure in place so that it is a good experience. And part of what this has done is it's actually normalized getting help. So at this point, we've connected a large number of employees with outside resources, and now it's something that employees talk about amongst themselves. It's something that's become normal at our organization. You want to make sure that you're recognizing and rewarding the people who go above and beyond, or experiencing more hardship than perhaps is their fair share. Going back to compassion satisfaction, employees feeling appreciated by their agency is a strong indicator of compassion satisfaction. So finding ways to do that, to make sure your top performers are being recognized for their hard work, and also people who may be struggling are getting the extra support that they need. And then you want to make sure that you're encouraging a work-life balance. A lot of us are short-staffed, and very grateful for the employees who are willing to come in and work extra. But if you've got employees that are working 8, 10, 12 shifts in a row, that's indicative of something else going on. And that may be avoidance in their own way. They may be using work as an avoidance coping mechanism for something in their personal lives, which is also not healthy. So we want to make sure that we're encouraging that. And like I said, it starts at the top. It starts with administration and management. It starts with field level supervisors. It starts with the people who are just role models in your agency. And maybe you don't have formal positions of leadership, but they're the people that others look to. It's important to have buy-in from all of those stakeholders, and to make sure that everybody is on board, and that people who are unwilling to change in this way, that's being addressed in some way or another. So we started the talk talking about stoicism. This is a quote from Marcus Aurelius, who is one of the original ancient Greek Stoic thinkers. And he said that you have power over your mind, not outside events. When you realize this, you'll find strength. And I think that's very true. The strength doesn't come from ignoring what's happened. The strength comes from having the power over your mind to deal with it. And so you have kind of that toxic brand of stoicism that, I'm tough, nothing bothers me. But then you can have a healthy form of stoicism that is, sometimes things bother me, but I'm in control of my emotions. I know how to process them. And I know how to do that in a healthy way that serves me and the people around me in the long run. So that is what I have for you. This is my contact information. Feel free to reach out to me via phone, text, or email if you have questions, or if you're just curious about sort of the way we do things at Guilford County, or about this topic. I'd also love to hear things that you're doing at your organizations that we might be able to use to improve upon what we're doing. But I'm happy to take some questions now if anybody has any.
Thank you so much. That was so helpful, and certainly has gotten lots of people's brains moving, thinking about new ways of doing things. As a reminder, folks, you are welcome to ask questions using the Q&A function, which is represented by the double dialogue bubble button. I see a couple questions coming into the Q&A, and I also got a question by email.
Okay.
The question we got by email is, what can my organization do to support post-traumatic growth instead of PTSD in our medics?
That's a great question. So there are, and that could be a whole webinar in and of itself. But there are certain steps that have been identified in helping to lead people towards post-traumatic growth. I will admit it's more challenging in the setting of the types of trauma we're exposed to, because most of the research is set up based on something like a natural disaster, something like a single occurrence traumatic event. But there are things that we can do, and I think it's training your peer support team members and how to talk people through these experiences in a way that helps them make sense of what's occurred, find the positive in it, sort of rewrite the narrative of the event to find the good, or if not good, at least the things that can be learned from it, and also to identify their role in that event and how they were able to make change, even if it didn't alter the outcome of the event as a whole, the ways in which they were able to make that situation better, even if it was just for a single person.
Thank you so much. And just a quick follow-up to that. You've mentioned peer support. Do you have any thoughts or feelings about critical incident stress management or critical incident stress debriefing? Because we have a lot of agencies that offer one or the other for after specific incidents.
Yeah, so it is part of our peer support program. So it is a tool. It is not the whole toolbox, though. So it is a way to deal with critical incidents, but you also need to be able to deal with things on a one-on-one situation, because group interventions are not best for everybody. It is a piece of peer support, but I think a lot of agencies still have a CISM team in lieu of peer support, and they're really not the same thing. It's just a piece of a greater whole.
Thank you so much for that insight. A different Amanda, shout out to my fellow Amanda, says or asks if there are any specific recommendations for getting leadership to model not being a duck.
Yeah, so this can be tricky, right? A lot of people still have kind of an old school mindset. I think I'm a very analytical person, and so I think showing some of this research that shows, like, hey, here are the negative outcomes of behaving in this way, not just for the individual, but for the organization as a whole. I think that's powerful. I think also, making it clear, changing the view of what makes somebody strong, and the idea that being vulnerable requires much more strength than just being silent. You can't be brave if you're scared to start with. That's not bravery. So I think just helping to change the mindset of what that looks like, and then also just the facts of the matter that quite frankly, the way we've always done things isn't really working, and we can't continue to keep doing things that way.
Thank you again. This has been an incredibly helpful presentation. We did have one more question come in under the wire here. From a recruiting perspective, are there any ways to help identify someone who might be changing jobs because of burnout or compassion fatigue?
So I think it's important to be doing pre-hire psychological assessments, just to make sure that people are in a relatively healthy place as you're hiring them. I think some things just to look for sort of unofficially are, ideally you want employees that are coming to your organization, not fleeing from something else. That's not to be said that there aren't organizations that are kind of toxic and worth leaving just on those merits. But you want people who are still have a sense of that compassion and satisfaction. You want people who still are getting fulfilled by the work and finding meaning in it. That find it, that find helping people to fill their cup, so to speak, as opposed to just going through the motions.
That's really helpful. Thank you so much. Mark was asking if you had any recommendations for online or free resources on these topics. I did share in the chat the American Ambulance Association resources. So we have a culturally competent counselor match program that's free to EMS providers through our partnership with the Firefighter Behavioral Health Alliance. And we also do offer on-site CSM for agencies that are members that don't have it, if they have a staff death or a particularly traumatic call. But I didn't know if you had other resources that you would recommend that people look into to help with these topics.
There are a number of really good resources out there. What I would say is I could maybe, Amanda, send you an email with a list of some resources if you want to then share it with the participants. Because off the top of my head, I know I would miss some.
Absolutely, that would be wonderful. We could actually put that list into the webinar description for anyone who is on the webinar page in the future looking at the archive, or the folks here who might be downloading the slides. So that would be really helpful if you don't mind doing so.
Absolutely, I'd be happy to.
Wonderful. So that looks to be the end of our questions for today. Again, I just wanted, on behalf of all of us that we're here to experience your presentation firsthand, I know I have many new things to think about, including some philosophy that I probably haven't thought about in 20 years. So I really appreciate the greater context as well as the really specific recommendations. So this has been incredibly helpful. We're so grateful for your time and thought. And for everyone who tuned in today, we will be posting the archive to our website within 48 hours and emailing it out in our next member newsletter. And everyone in the chat is saying what a great session this was. So thank you again, everyone, for tuning in. Thank you to our fabulous presenter, and we hope that you'll.
Oh, thank you.